Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field. Sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
And we go back to J.D. Rockefeller's statement that I will pay more. Interesting. Here's a guy that made his money from oil. He didn't say, I'll pay more for the guy that can find oil. He didn't say that. He didn't say, I'll pay more to the guy that can get more value out of a barrel at the refinery. He didn't say that. He said, I will pay more to the guy who can, quote, manage. And he was not talking about motivating. He was talking about pulling the levers of power everywhere he needed to pull them. He needed to pull them in the federal government. He needed to pull them in the state governments. Because everywhere he operated, he had to make peace with those people. And they were not, they weren't ready to give Rockefeller a global national global monopoly on the production and distribution of gasoline and oil products. That was not like a natural thing. There were a lot of other companies involved. All those companies had a degree of political influence and power. So that was a war. Right. And that was a war that Rockefeller won. And it was a war. I mean, there were things like refineries being dynamited in the middle of the night and nobody knew how it happened. I mean, it was wild and crazy. And there is a theory. I'm going to go, this now is in the realm of unproven, but it's very interesting. And it speaks to logistics. You've heard of prohibition, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Right. Everybody's heard of it. And what was prohibition about?
The evils of alcohol and how it had to be, people had to not be allowed to have alcohol to help all of America's evils.
There you go. I mean, what could be more marvelous? Now, if you know American history before, certainly before Prohibition, but even after, we're a hard drinking country. I mean, maybe a little less so now, but certainly from the days of the founding fathers, we had the Whiskey Rebellion, and the reason we had the Whiskey Rebellion is whiskey was such an important commodity for the development of this country that when they raised the taxes on it, literally the farmers in parts of this country actually went to war and had to be brought down by the U.S. military. That's how serious that war was, right? So we are a country based on the consumption of alcohol for the purposes of consciousness alteration. Or self-administered ethanol poisoning. We're based on that. So tell me, how did a bunch of church ladies convince an all-male, hard-drinking U.S. political structure to make the consumption of alcohol or the manufacture of alcohol illegal? How did that happen? Who funded that? Well, you might not be surprised to know that was funded by J.D. Rockefeller, because he had pangs of conscience. And as a good Baptist, he felt that alcohol was the ruination of society. And he thought, these ladies, by God, they had a great idea. I'm going to fund them. And, next thing you know, all these guys that I'm sure were drinking like fish decided to ban their most important recreational activity. How long did Prohibition last? Well, it lasted for a fixed period of time. Would you believe that coincidentally, at the time that Prohibition started, automobiles could be run on either alcohol or gasoline? And by the end of Prohibition, there was a nationwide service station network so that one could drive from one end of this country to the other and be able to count on gasoline. And that's when Prohibition was lifted. Now, I'm not saying those two things are related, but I'm saying that these guys are playing three-dimensional chess, and they are not clueless when it comes to manipulation of society. And which brings us to, that's a really important topic, and then we're going to get back to political corruption. Edward Bernays. This is such an important person to understand, Edward Bernays. And not until the Enlightenment, right? The 1700s it began, and then the 1800s, you started to have universal literacy, and then you had a certain amount of because of industrialization, people actually had a little bit more political power. You know, when you're a farmer out in the middle of the boondocks, you know, raising your annual crop, there's not a whole lot not a whole lot you can do. You might be prosperous, but however, when you start having concentrations of people in the cities and they start making money and saving money, and now you have real estate going on and retail sales, and now people are going to school, and it became necessary to run this industrial machine to actually educate people. So suddenly we had education and we had universal literacy, and then now we had publishing. And people don't get, like, everyone thinks, oh, you know, the Gutenberg Bible, that changed everything. Not really. Not really. Until post-Civil War, you had to have big bucks to have a personal library in your home. You might have one Bible. You might have one document printed thing in your home, pre-Civil War, and it would have been a family Bible, meaning it was passed down generation by generation. You didn't go to the bookstore. You didn't go to Barnes & Noble. You didn't go to Amazon and just get whatever book you wanted. Yeah. So it wasn't until the industrialization of the world that we had universal literacy and access to printed material and the ability for people to actually generate their own printed material. So this is a relatively new thing. That changed the power dynamic in the world radically. And it weakened the people that run things, who own things. You know, previous to that, not that much earlier, you know, go back to the 1700s and we've got, you know, the king of France, and we've got, you know, it was all kings and dukes and princes, and these were not ceremonial titles. This was absolute authority. You know, the church had the ultimate authority, and then the church would sort of parcel out, okay, we're going to let you run France. Just make sure you kick back, you know, our share, but we're going to claim that you're ordained by God. So this is your territory. And, you know, if the king wanted, and literally this was only 200, well, let's see, we're 2020. We have to go back maybe 250 years. Literally, the king could send somebody to your house right now because of this conversation, pull you out of the door, and have your head chopped off right on the spot because you've offended him. Yeah. That's only 250 years ago. So if we talk about institutions and absolute power and corruption and pathology and psychopaths running things and an absolute disregard for decency and humanity, that was kind of the norm of the elite for the most part. I mean, occasionally you'd have an enlightened king, but they were so rare, they're legendary. It was pretty much whoever was the biggest thug in town, who could collect the biggest collection of thugs in town that ran things. And depending on how, you know, psychopathic they were either horrible or unbelievably horrible. But it was, you know, somewhere in that continuum. That was humanity. And the control was basically violence. And there was sort of the psychological control exerted by the church. Cause, you know, until the Protestant Reformation, the church, they ran the show, like birth, marriage, death. You know, we gotcha. And, no, you're not going to be able to understand those things we're saying in the weekly mass you have to attend, because we're going to do it in Latin. You know, just assume we know what we're doing, you know? So like all these things that happened, you know, the translation of the Bible into vernacular, I mean, that was like radical. And that's only 400 or 500 years ago. So when you look at today, we think, oh, we're so modern and everything, but we're basically this very, very thin, tiny sliver of history where you have universal literacy. You have people who can read books. And for the most part, people have been really under the thumb. And the people at the top, whoever are running the powerful organizations, still have that same mentality. Now, here's where we get into Edward Bernays. The power shifted, and it became obvious that we can't thug our way into making people do what we want. We have to persuade them. And Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he was really enamored of his uncle's theories on the unconscious and irrational motivations and so on. During World War I, you know, got to remember, America was its own place. We weren't really involved with Europe. We weren't really interested in Europe. We had no reason to be involved in World War I because that was a family dispute between one branch of a family in Germany and another branch of a family in England for the domination of Europe.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Commercial domination of Europe. There was no moral issue at stake. No one was being taken to camps. There was no slave labor going on. None of that was going on. It was just pure, we want to steal your stuff. No, we want to steal your stuff. And they were just fighting it out. So we had no reason to be in that war. And England, which is very, 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 very clever at propaganda, just historically, remember England started out as basically a rural island, without a whole lot going on. And its primary, industry was raising sheep and piracy. I mean, that's how they made their money. And, they ended up basically taking over the world. And, because they were very ambitious and they were masters of propaganda and psychological warfare. They're very, 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 very good at it. Because they started out in an underdog position. Because remember, when they, and I seem to be going in a lot of directions, but it really all fits together. So when they were getting started, they were just this little rural island country. And then you had Spain, which had all the money in the world, owned the whole Western Hemisphere, had gold being shipped to them by the, hundreds of tons every year from the New World. I mean, they had the lock on everything. And then you had this little Protestant England, trying to hold its ground. And that underdog mentality fostered in them a high degree of intelligence and cunning and strategy. And they succeeded in sort of flipping the scenario and essentially taking over the world. The 19th century belonged to England. They were in every country running everything. So anyway, they're very good at propaganda. So when they went to war with Germany in World War I, they realized they needed help and they realized they needed to somehow tap the United States. Now, there are a lot of Germans that live in the United States. In fact, I think there was a period of time where there were more people of German American ancestry in the United States than English American ancestry. Americans until recently were militant about drinking coffee and not tea because they remembered way back to the 1700s when the English were thugs beating them up. And that's one of the reasons Americans are coffee drinkers more than tea drinkers. We rejected the English product and went with coffee. That's changed because we, forget. So we did not have a national proclivity to, jump in that war on England's side. So England sent their top propaganda experts to work with Woodrow Wilson and a thing called the Creel Committee. This is a very important moment in American history. C-R-E-E-L, Creel Committee, was founded. And the Creel Committee's job was to persuade Americans that we should send our young men and shed their blood and spend our money going to fight in a purely European war that was basically a dynastic war between two branches of two greed-head families that, who cared which one of them won? It really didn't matter. But England persuaded. Now in Canada, and this seems like it's going off the deep end, but follow me. In Canada, where you didn't have, where the English ran Canada and the German people were a minority, you had actual violence against, German Canadian citizens. You had cities, there was Berlin, Ontario had its name changed, I think, to Waterloo. So it was not only could you not speak up on behalf of Canada not going to war on the English side, if you did, well, you couldn't, not only could you not speak up on behalf of it, just being a German Canadian was dangerous to your health, including losing your position if you were a university professor. That's how strong the propaganda was in Canada. So So you had this Creel Committee, and their job was to design propaganda to persuade the average American that the Hun were the world's worst people and that we had to get behind the Brits. And they did things like they trained over 2,000, quote, spontaneous speakers who would go to movie theaters and jump up while the reel was being changed and give these fake emotional appeals of how terrible it was, that the Germans were so terrible and the British were so wonderful and we've got to go and help, that was one of their strategies. But anyway, there were two people on the Creel, many people involved in this Creel Committee, but there were two people. One was Ivy Lee and the other was a guy named Edward Bernays. Ivy Lee went to work for Rockefeller. And then Rockefeller actually loaned Ivy Lee to the Nazis in the 1930s.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
And you may say, well, my God, Ken, what is this all about? Okay. We, the industrialists of the world, the Rockefellers of the world, the DuPonts of the world, loved Hitler. They loved him in the early days. They may have always loved him, even afterwards, but in the early days, they loved him. Why? Because he was organizing Europe in a way that made it easy for the Rockefellers to make money and the DuPonts and all those people to make money. Instead of all these disparate countries going their own way and having to deal with 10 different countries, it was all going to be under one flag and a guy that was bribable.
Like the European Union nowadays.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, in Europe, that's a whole nother kettle of fish. And they loved Mussolini for the same reason. He was going to get rid of the labor unions, going to beat down labor. He was going to elevate the corporation, and he was going to rationalize everything. The trains were going to run on time. He was going to be an easy guy to deal with. So now Hitler had public relations problems just like everybody. So Rockefeller literally loaned him his chief PR guy. Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, who was the PR commander of the Nazi government, was a huge fan of Edward Bernays. In fact, Edward Bernays wrote a book called The Crystallization of Public Opinion. And Goebbels thought so highly of that book that he had stacks of it in his office. And every time he had a meeting with somebody, he would give the person that book to take home. Now, everybody's heard of Kristallnacht, right? I'm sure you have.
The Night of Broken Glass. Yeah. Kristallnacht.
Yeah. Except if you speak German, crystal does not mean glass. And it doesn't mean mirror, and it doesn't mean any of the things that were broken that night. So I ask you, where did the term crystal come from in Kristallnacht? It came from Edward Bernays' book, The Crystallization of Public Opinion. Kristallnacht was basically a public relations, a sinister one and a violent one, but it was a live demo. It was a demo. It was an event. It was a PR event. So what they did was one night. It was a night, which spread out, and it ultimately spread out into multiple days. But it had an initial boom where there was this one night where they sent out all the thugs to break all the windows in all the stores owned by Jewish merchants, and they called it Kristallnacht. And amazingly, nobody has ever asked, what's the source of that name? Because they didn't break crystal. And a store window is fenster. It's not crystal. So, I put two and two together on that. And it's known that Goebbels was a huge fan of Bernays. It's known that he gave that book out. And I just have to assume, and he used an Edward Bernays technique. One of Edward Bernays' many techniques, and it's not really new to him, but it was having the big launch, the big day, the big promotional explosion where you have this event that captures the headlines and starts the tongues wagging. Okay. That is a tried and true method, especially when you're trying to do something national, international. So one of Edward Bernays' greatest hits was persuading women in America to smoke cigarettes. And you may say, what's this all about? You're going to see this is all connected. Previous to Bernays' campaign, it was considered like, whores smoke cigarettes. Like, it's like smoking crack. Like, no decent woman is going to smoke crack,
Right.
And so luckily women had the intelligence, and they didn't have the money too, by the way, because tobacco was expensive. They didn't smoke. Women didn't smoke. Imagine that. They didn't smoke. So, the cigarette makers, one guy in particular, I forget his name, went to Bernays and said, look, the only way we're going to grow this market, and I know, every businessman knows, if you want to make money, you got to grow your market. And so they went to Bernays and said, how are we going to grow the market? And Bernays came up with the brilliant idea of, well, we could double the market if we got women to smoke. And then he had the challenge, how are we going to get women to smoke when it's considered a sleazy, dirty, anti-feminine, disgusting habit? How are you going to get women to do that? And you do that with psychological warfare, which is what Bernays learned both from his experience in the Creel Committee working directly with these master propagandists from the UK, and he also learned studying his uncle's work on the unconscious. And so what he did was he went out and he studied the psychology of women. And he discovered that women are extremely fashion conscious. I don't think this is a sexist thing. I just think it's true. Men, blue jeans and a t-shirt, we're good. Blue suit, red tie, white shirt, we're ready to go. We can wear that every day of the week. We're never going to be embarrassed. Women just don't do that, can't do that, whatever society, whether it's socially induced or biologically induced, we don't know why it is, but we just know women they like to change their fashion. So he did a very deep dive into the understanding of fashion. And he started this is how detailed this campaign was. He took the color of Marlboro. Marlboro used to have a green cover. It turned red later, but it used to have a green cover. And he went to all the fashion houses and started selling them on making that the color of the year. Okay. This is how, when I talk about industrial, indicates vision, reach, and scope of operations. Now, you have a business, I have a business, we're small business people. It's just me and my wife and we have some vendors and I don't know how big your business is, but we do business, we make money, we're doing fine. But I don't operate with I don't have thousands of operatives at my command,
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I can't call up the head of Vogue magazine and say, I want you to make green the color this year. I don't have that kind of leverage. But here's the thing. We have to understand there are people that do. And this is going to come full circle with the COVID thing in a bit. But I want you to see how these operations work. So he had the insight and the canniness and the connection and the personal power to call the editors at Vogue and all these fashion magazines and make this cigarette carton color popular. That was just one of the things he did. The next thing he did was he staged an event. Okay. Kind of like Kristallnacht, big, high-profile event that captured everybody's attention, captured the media, and set the tone. Right? If you imagine the mind as a piece of unshaped clay, right? And if I'm the first person that can get in there on a particular topic and mold the clay, I am so far ahead of anybody that comes after me because they've got to try to unmold it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
True.
So why did the Nazis all go out on one night and do it all at one night and declare it? They wanted to cat the headlines and they wanted to set the tone, right? What Bernays did, and you have to envision what society was like then. There was no television. There was no radio. All entertainment was live, right? Parades still are a big deal. But in those days, parades were like 10 times as significant, maybe 100 times as significant as they are today. Why? Because there were no movies. There was, you know what I mean? It was all, maybe there were movies, but that movies were pretty new. Everything was live. So the idea of shutting the city down and everybody coming out and watching everybody march, that was a big deal. So one of the biggest deals in America was the annual Easter parade in New York City. Okay. So the whole country looked to, just like they look even today, they look to the Thanksgiving parade, right? The Macy's Thanksgiving parade. Everybody tunes in and So imagine
until they destroyed it this year, but yeah.
Until right, exactly, right. But imagine the power and the persistence of that. Like I'm in Iowa, right? And why am I in Iowa sitting in front of the TV watching a Thanksgiving parade in New York City? But you know what? It's one of those persistent cultural things. Whether it makes sense or not sense, it has power. So anyway, the Easter parade in New York City in those days had massive power. One of the reasons? Demonstration of fashion. Why? New York City women, the richest, the most fashionable people in the world, they're going to wear their best clothes in the Easter parade. There's even a song. Wear my Easter bonnet, in the Easter parade. All right. So this was the event where all women in America had their minds focused on what are these rich, fancy ladies in New York City going to be wearing at the Easter parade. So what he did was he hired a bunch of fake suffragettes, because now simultaneous, and this just shows they're playing 3D chess. Okay. These are not unsophisticated people. He's talking with the editors at Vogue. He's engineering the parade. He's also seeing the way the wind is blowing. And this was at the time when women were agitating for the right to vote and had not yet gotten it. And so there was a lot of energy in the air about that. So he got some suffragettes, some young women, to march together in the parade, and he stage managed it with the media present. He told them, make sure you're in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral because something exciting is going to happen. And by the way, that's how all these media events happen. They always, they're never spontaneous. They always know something's going to happen. They tell the media in advance so that they can be there with their camera. So he told the media, there's something exciting. Can't tell you what, but make sure you're there with your cameras at front of St. Patrick's. So when the suffragettes, and as the way parades work is they have to stop at each corner so the traffic on the cross streets can go through, and then they resume the parade, and it stops and goes and stops and goes. That's a New York City parade. So you knew these girls were going to stop in front of St. Patrick's. So the girls stopped, cameras were ready. They all whipped out cigarettes. These fashionable, sexually attractive, cutting edge, avant-garde, happening young ladies in the big city all whipped out a cigarette. And somebody yelled, "Torches of Liberty!" And that became the meme. We have memes now on the internet. Well, they had memes 100 years ago, believe me. And now what he did was with that event, with that moment in time, now he stage managed it. He really thought it out. And he had the media there to help pump it. He created a meme that women smoking cigarettes was fashionable, acceptable by the upper class, and a sign of personal freedom and liberation. It was a crystallizing moment, the crystallization of public opinion. Okay. It's like, if you ever took a chemistry course in school, they have a catalyst, it's the coolest part of chemistry to me. And you have this beaker and there's liquid in it and you drop like a fleck of something in it and the whole beaker turns into solid. It's a catalyst, right?
Right.
And the same thing happens in society, and you can engineer those catalysts if you think it out carefully. All right. So it seems like what are you talking about? How does this have anything to do with the present? This same level of thinking, thoroughness and wiredness and scope and vision and coordination occurs in 2020. It didn't die with Edward Bernays and the Easter parade. Okay. They do this shit all the time. How do you think they get us into any of these crazy wars? There's not a single war we have been in since World War II that we had any reason to be in. And yet they managed to get everybody not only out in the street waving the flag, but shouting down at anybody who dared to question it. Now, eventually everybody wakes up and go, why are we in Vietnam again? Why are we in Afghanistan again? But I'm old enough to remember when I was a kid in my social circle, middle class Catholic New Jersey, you didn't question the Vietnam War, period. Right. And, even in this country, I remember, and I put it in writing and I time stamped it. I said, if we go into Iraq, it's going to be worse than 1,000 Belfasts. You are not going to be able to hold that country together. And it turned out to be literally, in terms of death and financial devastation, worse than 1,000 Belfasts. But anyway, I had people just hinting at that, and I didn't push it to my customers, but I guess it leaked out that I had that opinion, and I had people, unsubscribe and stop doing business with me. C'est la vie.
I'm sure. Yeah. Well, what about with the COVID stuff? I'm sure you've had.
Well, you know what? It's interesting.
And some scream.
And, I'm in a different position now. I made my money, and I mean, certainly the government could come and take all my money away and impoverish me, I guess. But that's how it's going to have to happen. Like it's going to be hard to exhaust my money supply at this point, and I not only have, holdings, I also have, I live on the income that comes in. Like I don't even need to touch my savings. So whereas back in those days I was worried. I was trying to build a business. Now I don't really care. Like if I just feel like I have to say what I have to say. And if I lose customers over it, so be it. But interestingly enough, except for a couple of people that I don't really care about, one guy was passionate. He goes, "How dare you question the scientific validity of vaccines?" I'm like, dude, you got to be kidding. And the funny thing is, I know for a fact this guy is in very poor health, and he could probably solve his health problem if he had a little intelligence. But that's a whole other story. So yeah, I might have, in this case, I might have strained my standing among my customers, believe it or not. But even if I lost them, in this case, I just had to say whatever I had to say. But the point I want to make is, if these guys can drive us to war, which is the most extreme, destructive, self-destructive, immoral, activity imaginable. I mean, like if they invade us, I'm going to pick up a gun and start shooting, but I'm not going to say, hey, let's do aerial bombardment of civilian targets in Belgrade. I mean, I'm not going to do that under any circumstance, and yet they got millions of Americans to say, yeah, it's a great idea. Not only that, we're going to shout you down if you dare question it. So the fact that they have that wired, the same, they actually share personnel, the Pentagon PR and the CDC and NIH, share personnel. They share methodologies. I'm sure they go to similar trainings. They actually sometimes do joint operations. In fact, I mean, what is it? Operation Warp Speed? They have a general running that.
I didn't realize that.
Oh my God, guys, everybody, if you're not aware of that clusterfuck, yeah, please, everybody should, Google Operation Warp Speed and see who's running it. It's run by
Tell me a little bit about what you know, yeah.
Well, it's two people. One is a medical bureaucrat. The other is a guy who's a Army general who's famous for logistics, period. I mean, he's got no medical or public health training, and he's completely focused and organized on getting the vaccines delivered and administered. And that's a scary thing. You don't want Pentagon power behind, forcing an experiment. I hope everybody knows. And if you don't know this, you can confirm this yourself. Again, just don't need to read any conspiracy websites. Just go straight to the CDC and the FDA websites. You don't need an NIH websites. You do not need to read Alex Jones or wonder if this was invented in a vial. Just read their own bloody websites. This is not a vaccine. This is gene therapy. Okay. And not only
do you think evil has Tourette's syndrome, meaning that it has to tell you what it's doing? I've seen that in movies, and you think, oh, it's ridiculous. Why would the bad guy say what he's about to do? But in real life, it seems like the same thing. It's weird.
They say they know with confidence that no one. Well, I'll give an example. So one of our presidents was shot in the head from 3 directions in broad daylight in front of hundreds of people, and the guys that did it got away with it. And one of the people, that's John F. Kennedy, and one of the people who appears to have been involved was a guy named John Foster Dulles, who had a very big political animus towards Kennedy. And interestingly enough, Dulles was made head of, or one of the key members of the committee to investigate the assassination. And he was a lawyer. And one of his jobs, interestingly enough, was to help whitewash all the returning, this is called Operation Paperclip, and a lot of, Nazi physicians and not just Nazi scientists and even Nazi political people were sheep dipped. They were given new identities or made to appear to be innocuous and brought into the United States to work for NASA, to work for the CIA. This is not theory, by the way. This is not conspiracy theory. This is now established history. We did that for two reasons. One, some of these guys had really useful information. Werner von Braun really knew a lot about rocketry. He just happened, he really wasn't, and we really wanted him. And the fact that he was a Nazi and that they used slave labor to build those V2 rockets, well, we kind of overlooked that and we made him an important person at NASA. So that was one thing. We wanted their technology. The other thing is there was a lot of U.S. still during the war, there was a lot of cooperation, ongoing cooperation between U.S. corporations and the Nazi regime, illegally, by the way. And there was even something like 100 employees of Chase Manhattan Bank that were stationed in Germany that just kept working throughout the war. And so Dulles had two jobs. One was to bring over the useful engineers and scientists, and then his other job was to kind of make these corporate treasonous activities disappear into the mist. And he succeeded in both. And you can go back and find there were hearings about all this, and there were some senators that were up in arms. George Herbert Walker Bush's father was extremely involved in Nazi financing, working with Nazi industrialists, helping make Nazi money move from Germany to the United States. I mean, it was just lunacy, but they got away with it. And Roosevelt, who was not a saint, was actually trying to go after these guys, and he just didn't make it. He died. He just was too old and he was sick and he died. And Truman was basically, I know they canonized Truman as the great, all-American president, but he was basically, he wasn't going to do anything substantial, and he was only in for a term anyway, and he let them run wild. And by the time, and then they put Eisenhower in charge, and Eisenhower spent his whole term playing golf. And at the very end of when he was on his way out the door, he gave that famous speech about the military industrial complex and what a danger it was. And, I'm glad he gave that speech, but it might have been better if he fought it while he was actually president. But maybe these guys can't fight it. I don't know. But anyway, going back to your question about them giving up the ghost and actually telling us what's going on, what Dulles said was, look, we're going to have and they, in fact, if you get I forget what they call the investigation of Kennedy's assassination. It had a name. I forget what it is, but they published their findings. It was 20 volumes. Each volume was 500 pages. And as any good lawyer knows, nobody's going to read all that shit. So if you actually went and read all the documents, there was enough clues in there just from what they actually reported to know that there was something completely fishy about the official story about how Kennedy died. Yeah, some guy he was a Marine and he went to Russia and then he came back and it was okay. And then he, and then suddenly, the whole thing was just ridiculous beyond belief. So anyway, you ask, do they give up their information? Well, they know two things. They know that 99% of people are not going to pay attention. They know that the news media that's in their pocket is not going to really pay attention. They're going to pay attention to the headline and they're not going to get into the detail. I mean, no one, for instance, how many people where have you seen, right? This is the biggest story on the planet Earth right now, this vaccine. Yes? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that and COVID, I guess. Yeah,
but at this point, let's say COVID's the novel and the chapter that we're in right now is the vaccine. Is it fair to say that?
I thought the chapter we're in is new mutation.
Oh, well, that's just a little subplot to help push the vaccine story. Believe me. But yeah, I get your point that's sort of the buzzword right now. But in terms of if we were in a chapter, like chapter 1 is the illness is discovered in China. Right, yeah. Chapter 2 is it hits Italy. Chapter 3, New York. Okay, now we're in chapter whatever. The vaccine's going to save us, right? So, but is it fair more or less to say that that's the biggest story right now, more or less?
Yeah. That's true.
Okay. How many times have you seen in any news outlet anywhere the fact that this vaccine, first of all, that it's not a vaccine, it's gene therapy. That it's not just gene therapy, it's experimental gene therapy. And it's not just experimental gene therapy, it's experimental gene therapy that they've tried and have never managed to make work. Okay? So they've left all that out, but we'll leave that aside.
Right.
Where have you heard anybody tell you that the FDA has never has authorized this under some Byzantine, legalistic, bureaucratic footnote? This was not authorized by normal means. I mean, has anybody mentioned that?
Was it done under like emergency use authorization?
Yeah. So you know that because you're an informed person. I doubt the average person is aware of that. Now, furthermore, because you're asking this, you're like, well, gee, they're telling us. Well, all this stuff that I'm talking about, you can find on the FTC's, the FDA's plain vanilla website in simple English. They really aren't hiding it. Well, they're hiding it in the sense that there's a headline, and the headline says the vaccine is safe and it's approved in quotes.
Right.
And it's safe. Okay? That's the headline. They are gambling, and it's a pretty good gamble. If I were a betting man, I would bet with them. They are betting that the average person is not going to actually read the fine print. They know the news media is not going to read the fine print, and if the news media does read the fine print, they're not going to report the significance of the fine print. And if the news media does report the significance of the fine print, their business office is going to get a phone call from their pharmaceutical PR friends saying, "What are you doing?" And that reporting is going to stop the next day. All right. Mm-hmm. So what people don't know, and they have a right to know, is this was passed using this thing called emergency use authorization, which is a relatively new deal. This is not something that existed in the 90s. This is a 2000s invention. Okay. And basically what it says is in emergency, we can authorize the use of medical procedures, drugs, whatever, and vaccines. Okay. What constitutes an emergency? Well, they say an emergency.
Yeah, that's been redefined along with everything else. Exactly.
When this, and it's all legalistic, by the way. It has nothing to do with medicine, has nothing to do with science. It has to, just like COVID. COVID as a diagnosis has absolutely nothing to do with science. It is a legalistic definition. All right. So originally, and people should know this, the original legalistic definition of an emergency was a chemical, biological, or radiological or nuclear threat, CBRN. And it was originally cooked up as a way to respond to terror threats. This is the legacy of 9/11. Right after 9/11, they got us, not only did they, do whatever they did in New York and the Pentagon, they also, scared us to death with anthrax. And then there was also a scare, which most people forget, that the next thing coming was smallpox. And they started talking about, well, if there is a smallpox outbreak, should we have forced vaccination of anti-smallpox? That was all in the air in the 2000s. So anyway, this law, it's not even a law. I'm not even sure. Maybe Congress authorized it. I don't know. But basically all this got cooked up that, hey, if we have one of these CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear attacks, we're going to be able to, on an emergency basis, do an EUA, an emergency use authorization, to permit any drug or surgical procedure or vaccine we come up with, no matter how lunatic it is. Okay. Now, as you point out, that morphed into naturally occurring emerging disease. Okay. No emphasis on the word emerging. Why do you think when this thing first hit the media, not when it first appeared on the planet, because we now know it was in Europe in the fall, maybe even in the spring of 19, maybe, who knows, it might have even been in the virus pool from the beginning of time. We really don't know. But we do know that it was in Italy before it was announced in China, and it appears to have been in Spain in the spring. So, but They needed to say, it's new, it's novo, it's new. Remember how?
Novel, yeah.
Novel, right? Now, I'm going to go back to the phrase, naturally occurring emerging disease. All right. So you can't so if there's a flu, you can't do an emergency use authorization and cook up a vaccine in your bathtub and start administering it to people. You just can't do it because it's the flu. But if you can call it an emerging disease, and if you can say that it's a biological threat, thanks to the legalistic definitions, you can use an MCM, which is a medical countermeasure. Okay? So that is, now, I ask you, this topic of the quote vaccine is the biggest topic on the planet Earth today. Where have you heard anybody spell out what I just spelled out to you?
Oh, I know. They don't tell you any of that stuff.
Okay. Yeah. And now here's the thing. It's all on the CDC website. And you don't even have to dig. And you don't even have to be a PhD in immunology and vaccinology. You know, they even put it in, but here's the thing. So you ask, why do they give this stuff away? It's like Madoff. Okay, let's go back to Bernie Madoff. There were guys in the financial industry that knew Bernie Madoff was a scam artist. And the reason they knew it was they looked at his annual report and they looked at the numbers and they knew they were impossible. Not because they were good, but because they were so consistent. Right. Nobody has consistent numbers like that. So, and they couldn't find a mechanism by which he was generating these numbers. It just seemed like the money went in and somehow he did magic and the money came out and it was fantastic. Well, he was made chairman of NASDAQ. I don't know if people remember that or even know that. This is not like a guy that was operating out of a shoebox, this was a guy that was absolutely 1000% mainstreamed. And if you dared say anything negative about him, you were considered a crank, right? So you might say, well, wait a minute, how do they get away with this? They know that once the meme is set that they're the genius and this is the right way, nobody, and that includes the news media, especially the news media. It includes our medical profession. It includes our local politicians who are beyond useless. They're not going to read the fine print. And if they read the fine print, they're going to go, oh, gee, this, and it becomes a silver or lead issue. If I stand up and say something, I'm out. I'm done. My career's over. If I shut up, I get to keep my job. So that's how, if you're asking, how did all these local politicians get corrupted? It's not necessarily they were given money. They were just shown that this is the consensus. Now, where the money came in, and I'm let's see if I can find it. The CDC, which is not Fauci's thing, but they're closely associated, was on its way to oblivion in the 1950s, because the reality is infectious diseases are really not that big a deal. If people are well nourished and they have decent sanitation and they're not being radically environmentally poisoned, you're not going to have outbreaks of stuff. Just doesn't happen. Just doesn't happen. And a lot of the energy and impetus behind dealing with infectious disease was the fact that people did live. You had malaria, and you still have malaria, and you do have certain infectious things that are, insect driven. But a lot of the things that people died, like I'm from a family, I have one branch of my family, my grandfather's side, half the kids died. Like they just died, because they were living in slums in New York, and they, my great aunt, who's my grandfather's sister on the Italian side, just so everybody can visualize how people in urban centers used to live. We might have talked about this. I can't remember. They lived in a 5-story walk-up, 4 apartments per floor. And in those days, who knows how many people per apartment? Big families, so 100, at least. Well, let's see, for 20, at least 100. Yeah, hundreds of people in this building. At least 100 people in this building. They had one water source for the entire building. It was a pipe in the backyard. So when you wanted water, you went out with buckets, you filled the buckets, and you brought it into your, to cook or to bathe or whatever. There were no toilets. The toilets were chamber pots. And when the guy came by with the cart and the horse and everything, you dumped your chamber pot. And when you wanted a good bath, you went to the public bathhouse. So infectious diseases were you could see why infectious diseases were a big problem. And people were malnourished and they were overworked and they were working in these horrific industrial settings. They were working 7 days a week and 12 hours a day. I mean, it was a nightmare. So now fast forward to the 40s. Well, we got a 40-hour work week. Everybody's got indoor plumbing. We're eating pretty well. We're all out in the suburbs. We're just not having these kind of problems anymore. So the CDC was on its way out. So here's the key. A very bright CDC guy, a politician, a man that understood the levers of power and knew that survival was everything, realized that if you could link public health to defense, you could preserve the CDC. Because, and if you could package the CDC as one of the frontline defenders of America, suddenly this thing, which was on its way to oblivion, would now have a reason to be and a source of funding and so on. Now they did one other piece, and this will finally bring us full circle, and we'll start to really understand why this COVID thing worked so well for the bad guys. This is a sideline for me. I'm not a full-time reporter. I'm not writing a book on this. I'm always wishing this thing's going to come to an end so I can stop spending my time on this, But
you spend a lot of time learning about it and living
it's
experiences together.
It's the issue of the day, and just like I dove into the internet when the internet was new and I left no stone unturned, and the internet was the big issue of the 90s. That was probably the biggest long-term force that we had. And I just dug into it. And I had like I was saying, I already had a real interest in media, and I had an interest in the history of media and the development of media and all the neuroscience of attention and memory formation. And, I had this body of knowledge that I was able to crystallize around looking at the internet, right? So here we are in this other realm of this huge story that's clearly going to define the next 10 years, if not 20, if not 100, if we're not careful. So it's got my attention, and I happen to have a lot of the tools to analyze it. And luckily I have the time. Its nickname is the medical CIA, and I don't have, let me see if I can. Anyway, so what they did, the CDC formed this organization that would take the best and the brightest of American medicine and American science and train them in the CDC's view of the world. Okay. It's called the Epidemic Intelligence Service. Okay. The Epidemic Intelligence Service, the EIS. Okay. It's a 2-year postdoctoral program, funded. You're paid like a rock star. You're fed caviar, I'm sure. And what do you learn? Okay, let me read it. Let me read what the EIS is. It's a long-standing, globally recognized fellowship, renowned for its investigative and emergency response efforts. Learn about the disease detectives and alumni who make up this program's distinguished network. Okay, so I'm going to get back to that in a second. Their network. This is the key. This is the key to the whole puzzle. How this happened, how they were able to take over the world's mind so fast. Yes, they had the media. Yes, they could get the doctors and the sleazeball politicians in line. But how did they get the public health officials who were the advisors to the governors? How did they get that done so fast? Okay, now, right on their homepage is the following. Media and publications. An EIS officer's work on the front lines of public health, their service and publications may attract the attention of news media and public health partners. Underline that in your mind, public health partners. Read about offers investigations, findings, and insights for public health through news coverage, publications, authored to inform public health action, and inspired entertainment inspired by the EIS network. Okay. So on their front page, they are already talking about the they're talking about it, not a conspiracy theory, not Alex Jones, right? This is their own freaking website on the homepage of this organization, which they created and they named the Epidemic Intelligence Service. They are talking immediately about influencing the press. Okay. So, and not only the press, but public health partners. Who are these public health partners? These are the public health officer of the state of New York, the public health officer of the city of New York. It's a club. It's a profession. They all know each other. I'm sure every year they gather once or twice in some glamorous spot to get drunk and go to meetings and conference seminars and so on. They all know each other. And when they need a job, they're all, hey, they're all networking. So this is a little club of people. And who is working on these people day in and day out, day in and day night, and day in and day out? The Epidemic Intelligence Service run by the CDC. They're constantly producing news articles, publications. They're influencing news coverage. They are also inspiring entertainment. How many movies have we seen? Yeah, right? How many movies have we seen in the last 10 years about these disease fighters, solving this disastrous epidemic of whatever?
Yeah, so Hollywood is a big propaganda mouthpiece for a lot of different issues.
And I don't know how many people are aware, but the Pentagon has a whole department, again, guys who show up on Monday with their donuts and it's 9:00 and they got the coffee and the phone, and their job is to liaison with Hollywood, to read scripts, to provide free technical advice, and also to provide guidance. Like, we don't really like the representation that you have in this scene. Why don't you moderate it a little bit? And if you do, that scene where you need 5, Phantom whatever jets to fly through the sky, and, we'll lend them to you. How's that? Done. Okay, so it's been a long time since a movie's been made that showed the military in anything other than a glowing light. That is not an accident. That is not an accident. So, promotion, recruitment tools. Yeah.
So with all these forces, how do terrible things end? Considering that COVID's on the scale of, it's not on the scale of Nazi Germany, but it's on a big, big scale worldwide.
Well,
how do we stop it?
We say it's not on the scale of Nazi Germany. It's just a different form, but it's a similar size. And, I don't know if I've had a couple of interviews, and I don't know if you and I talk about this, but one of the many corruptions that the Nazi regime, was involved in was the corruption of medicine. And, it's traditional going back to the Middle Ages, probably even earlier, that tremendous number of people of Jewish ancestry involved in medicine. It's a historic thing. It goes back to the beginning of time. And that was true in Germany. You had a lot of Jewish doctors. So what do you think happened to those Jewish doctors during the Nazi regime? If they were the heads of hospitals or the heads of this or the head of that or the head of academic departments, maybe they were fired. And not maybe, they were. And who were they replaced by? There's a book by a guy named Lifton, who's an MD, who made his life's work studying this. Big, thick book called The Nazi Doctors, very well documented. And by the way, there were court cases. We always hear about the Nuremberg Trials. Well, part of the Nuremberg Trials involved prosecutions of doctors. And so there was quite a bit of evidence, formal evidence presented. And there was enough evidence that some of those doctors were hung. Others were imprisoned for extended periods of time. And remember, we're only seeing, that was based on the cases, we know how the world works. Not everything makes it to trial, not all the evidence is gathered, right? So, but of the evidence that was actually preserved and presented at trial and prosecuted, it was serious enough for the ultimate penalty for some of these guys. So it turns out that the profession in Germany that had the highest percentage of card-carrying Nazi party members. Now remember, not every German person was a Nazi, and not every German person was a member of the Nazi Party. But there were people, obviously, clearly, civilians, who were enthusiastic members of the Nazi Party. Well, the profession in Germany that had the highest percentage of card-carrying members of the Nazi Party was the medical profession. And this is statistically factual, and Lifton documents it in his book and so on. And they were rewarded with what you can reward doctors with: head of department at a university, head of a hospital, et cetera, et cetera. There were, as you know, a lot of enslaved people working for the Nazi war machine, basically, making everything, uniforms, and munitions, and cement, whatever industrial thing needed to be made for the war effort, they had slave labor doing it. They wanted these people to be productive. Now, and like all human beings, sometimes they got sick, and sometimes they had outbreaks given the terrible conditions of typhus and things like that. So all of these camps had hospitals, all these work camps, the slave labor camps. They all had hospitals, not out of humanitarian, but it's like, can we patch this guy back up and put him back on the line, or can we get our handle on this typhus outbreak so we don't lose the whole line? That's why they had the hospitals, right? So sometimes somebody would come in, this is all in Lifton's book, and he was too sick to go back to work. So what do? Put him in a nice hospital bed and feed him? No, you kill him. And a lot of people were killed medically, which you never hear about. You always hear about this, the ovens and the gas chambers. No. There were doctors, sinister beyond belief. There were doctors whose job was to administer a final shot to somebody and then falsify the death certificate because, perversely.
Again, it sounds familiar to this year.
Exactly. Perversely, the Nazis were actually law-abiding. They had laws, and they followed them. And it was actually, believe it or not, it was against the law for a doctor to murder a patient. I mean, I'm laughing out of, So what they did, you couldn't say, Mr. Jones came in, he was really too sick to go back to work, so we decided it's a very easy way to kill somebody.
They would treat them to death, essentially.
Well, one shot and he's gone, and, I don't want to get into it's logistically challenging to kill lots of people. So any easy way you can find, you take. However, it was against the law to do that. So what they did was they just changed the death certificate. And that was one of the crimes. Crime. I'm going to underline that. I want to put it in all caps and I want to bold it. It was a crime prosecuted in the Nuremberg Trials to falsify the cause of death. Okay. Now, let's fast forward to the present. We have Mr. Jones, 82 years old, diabetes, stage 4 cancer, heart disease. He has some kind of respiratory distress and has a heart attack and dies. And we say he died of COVID. Okay. So we're not far from the Nazis. We're just, we just don't have people goose-stepping around, on Broadway, with Nazi armbands.
Right.
We don't have that. But in terms of absolute corruption of our medical system, functionally, and I have an interview on the site with a nurse, a vet. She was over in Iraq and, with the special forces and, operated field hospitals there and, came back and trained up back over here and then became a, formal nurse and worked in Florida hospitals. And then they closed her hospital because there wasn't enough, they had the COVID scare and there wasn't enough business and nobody was coming in. So she went as a contractor to New York City. By the way, what do you think those contractors were paid that went to the New York City hospitals in April?
I don't know. Yeah, maybe a lot.
Give a guess. Cool. Just give a guess. Just for fun.
I don't know. $5,000 a week.
Try $10,000 a week, and they were paid by FEMA.
Mm.
Okay, And she arrived, and I think she said it was like 7 days before they even deployed her. She couldn't believe it. And she said there were other people that had already been there some crazy amount of time that hadn't they were getting $10,000 a week, and they hadn't even left the hotel. Okay? So when they finally got to when they finally were deployed, they were put on buses and sent to city hospitals, city-run hospitals. And I have the interview, and someday this is going to come out. She's got good legal representation, and someday it's going to come out. Anybody who walked in off the street with asthma, she had one guy, she said he had a panic attack, fear, just terror. A lot of people are very suggestible, and they're very fearful. And, they hear something in the news and they absolutely believe it. And then there's such a thing as a psychosomatic response. And, I try to moderate my aggravation with people buying this bullshit. And the way I do that is I just realize, well, gee, what if I was in a box and the only information I was getting was the terror? Maybe I would probably go with it too. But anyway, she said people were coming in with those kind of problems and they were being intubated. In other words, they were, people talk about, I don't know if we talk about this, but people
you did last time you said they put on paralytics and I was like, well, how can they call out for help or tell you what's going on? And you can't.
No, you can't. When they talk about vents, this is not just putting a little oxygen mask on somebody's face. When they talk about mechanical ventilation or venting somebody and intubating, they're talking about knocking that person out cold and jamming a pipe all the way down into their lungs, basically. And to do that, you need to knock them out. You need to paralyze them. You need to give them paralytic drugs. And you need to give them powerful analgesic drugs, like not aspirin. We're talking about, what's that stuff that kills people that they mix with heroin now?
Fentanyl?
Yeah, fentanyl. That's one of the things these people are getting. And it's not like you take a pill and, no, or they give you a shot and you go out. You're on IVs. So you have to imagine the guy's in bed. He's got a pipe down his throat. He's got an array of IVs, paralytics, analgesics, all these things, 24/7. And I asked her, I said, this is a dumb question. How do they eat? They don't. They're fed by tube. I go, how do they drink? Well, they don't. It's figured that the liquid in the IV is sufficient hydration. Okay? Well, that's interesting. How do they relieve themselves? Well, they have to be cleaned up on a regular basis. And then we're talking about people in this state for weeks and months. Okay? We're also talking about you need a crackerjack respiratory technician monitoring that person, right? Like, this is not something you just sort of put somebody in, then you just, you go and you knit or you watch TV and, check on them every now and then. And what she said was they had all the vents in the world in this hospital, and they put she said there was always somebody on a vent, and as soon as somebody died, they cleaned it off and they put another person on it right away. Okay. So they had all the vents in the world. She said they had almost no nurses with ICU experience, and they had, I think she said one respiratory technician per shift, which
you're going to be overwhelmed, right? Exactly. Yeah. You can't take care of people.
If you wanted to kill, now I don't know what their intention was. It might have just been psychotic, bureaucratic ineptitude. But if you wanted to kill a lot of people legally and get away, and don't forget, Cuomo gave a blanket immunity to all hospitals for a certain period, 2-month period when all this was going on, for everything, not just accidents, but malpractice, outright abuse, anything that went down in any medical facility in the state of New York during I think it was a 2-month period, total immunity to any sort of legal oversight or prosecution. Now you might say, how the hell, how on earth could that happen? That's so corrupt. Well, you have residents who are running the floors. They are just out of medical school. They don't know shit about anything. This is their first medical experience in their life. And then you have, I forget what you call it, attending physicians or supervise, whatever, who are supposedly supposed to supervise these guys. Some of them did. Some of them, she said, were MIA. They never even showed up.
Right.
All right. Now, Now so who runs the hospitals really? Well, the hospitals are really run by hospital administrators. Now, I asked her this and she didn't know the answer, and maybe somebody will know the answer. If you're a doctor, you have to take an oath. If you're a nurse, you have to take an oath to protect your patients. Does a hospital administrator have to take an oath? I'm going to guess a hospital administrator doesn't take an oath.
I don't think the oath holds them back anyway.
Yeah, and I think pretty much a hospital administrator is interested in the bottom line, and if the bottom line is we get so many tens of thousands of dollars per intubated patient on top of what we're able to charge for all these drugs, because imagine what a day on event must cost, the Medicare or Medicaid. The sky must be the limit, right?
I'm sure they allocate 24/7 supervision, even if they give like 2 minutes of supervision, then they can bill all that to whoever they need to bill it to.
And then every IV, and they get to mark, that gets marked up, and then the pharma reps are really happy, and keeping the pharma reps is happy is somehow important to hospital administrators. I haven't quite figured that out why. There's a really interesting movie, a documentary that we might have talked about. Forgive me if I'm going over old territory, but about hypodermic needles. One of the hazards of medicine is accidentally, if someone's got a seizure or they're, having a bad drug experience or whatever, and you accidentally stab yourself with a needle, and it may be dirty or, I don't know. All kinds of things can go wrong. And then you have the third world where people reuse needles because they're so poor. They put them in Clorox or they boil them or whatever. Well, there's a one-use needle that exists that, it's one use. You use it once and you can't use it again. And that just eliminates that problem. These guys tried to sell, and they were serious business people. They were all ready to manufacture it and produce it. And not only would the hospital administrators not accept this as an alternative or as a supplement or as an experiment, they wouldn't even talk with them. Well, I'll tell you experience I had. A friend of mine knows somebody. Actually, I'll tell you two experiences from the same guy. Number one, I used to have a really bad chronic back problem, and he said you should get a standing MRI. I said, I never heard of that. He goes, yeah, it's pretty unknown. But the guys that invented it, he said basically, you do an MRI, you're lying down. Well, maybe the problem doesn't show when you're lying down. It shows when you're sitting or when you're standing, which was my case. And wouldn't it be better to have an MRI that you could take standing up? So he knew the guys that invented this. And he said when they went to hospitals, they were told we're not interested at all. Because there's two companies, Siemens and another one, that own the MRI business. And they just didn't want the competition. Period. End of story. And somehow the hospital administrators, I don't know, this is probably maybe the most sinister profession in America that we don't know about. Somehow I'm sure they are so well oiled and fueled by pharma and the medical instruments industry that we can't even fathom how well bribed they are. Because they're the real, they're kind of like the spigot, they're kind of the connecting pipe between pharma and hospital. So what amount of money and influence wouldn't pharma spend to make sure that profession does their bidding? I'm sure if you're a hospital administrator.
Well, I'm sure they pick the medical equipment, and some of it could be faulty or not. They pick the drugs, generic or prescription. And, from what I've read and talked to people, generic drugs are incredibly problematic. The procedures used, the doctors that get to operate on people versus not. Everything.
Yeah. So this is very powerful. So the other story he told me, he knows a guy who has a consulting business, that he provides sort of high-level medical advice to like 300 of the Fortune 500 companies. And this guy told him point blank, if I had this COVID thing, this was early on, I'm getting on a vitamin C IV. But I would never say that publicly. So here's a guy that makes his living advising, Fortune 500 companies on medical issues, and he knows something that he's not going to go on the record for because he doesn't want his meal ticket taken from him and torn up. So when we go back to this corruption issue, it's a perfect storm too when it's when everybody has got the lead or silver choice. So if you're a hospital administrator, it's like, do you ruin this gravy train you're on, or do you just, buy more events and put more people on them and, call everybody a COVID case and shut up any, there were doctors very early on in New York that were saying, we should not be putting these people on vents. And those doctors were taken off the ICUs. And that was way back in April. They were all removed. There was this huge flurry of activity of Zoom calls, and a lot of them got captured on YouTube, and I saved a bunch of them, where these guys were genuinely like, hey, this doesn't look right. And you can't, and to an extent, you can't blame a doctor. You take, you tell he doesn't know, and you take him and you throw him in the ICU and you say, people are coming in with this disease and you gotta vent him. And he's like, okay. I mean, why should he have to double check everything that's told him by his superiors? He should be able to have faith, right? But what happened was they started doing it and they started realizing, whoa, I think this is the wrong way to go. And so you see these Zoom calls where these young doctors were like going, I don't know, man. And those guys disappeared. And they, at least one of them I know was just removed from the ICU, and who knows what happened to his career. And then of course, the blackballing. This is a kind of a sidebar, but it's very interesting. There was this crazy idea that Edward Teller came up with. They were trying to find peaceful uses for the atom bomb in the 50s. So he said, hey, why don't we use the atom bomb to build canals in Alaska? We'll just drop like 40 of them on Alaska and build a port and build a canal system, and it will be great, And these two Arctic ecologists went on, put their careers on the line and said, I don't think it's a good idea, I don't think you should drop atom bombs on Alaska. Both those guys were blackballed for life out of academia. I think one ended up, it's all documented in a book called The Firecracker Boys. And I think one ended up in Canada. He was given and he became the most esteemed, Arctic ecologist of his generation. It wasn't like these were lightweight guys.
Yeah, of course.
But by virtue of the fact that they went on the record and said this was a bad idea, they were blackballed in all of the American academia. See, these networks, they're not visible to us. Like we kind of imagine that everything's being run rationally and everything's being run on a sort of a fair basis. It doesn't occur to us that all the college presidents are pretty much part of the same club. And maybe they're not malicious, but if they're told, don't hire this guy, they're not going to look into it. They're just not going to hire him.
So is corruption the default mode of humanity, or just large institutions?
I see there's this myth. Interesting. The news media and political pundits, like to focus on the misdeeds of individuals. And God knows some individuals do some really heinous stuff, but that's not the norm. I think if you look at like little children, even young, as soon as they can walk, they like to cooperate. They like to help, or they get distracted and they run off and do, but they have this built-in impulse to participate and help and be productive and they want to help. They want to do good things,
Yeah.
So I think that's the real default of human beings in individually and in small groups. There's always exceptions. There are people that are just whacked and, they're hopeless. But and we all have our foibles and, but in general, human beings are decent. But, I think once you get these concentrations of power where money's involved, that are big enough to be worth bribing. I guess the issue is when it gets to be big enough for professional bribers to get involved, that's when the game is lost, right? So, the Pentagon, hopeless, right? If you're a general and you approve all kinds of bullshit, weapon systems, when you retire, you're getting a job with Grumman or Lockheed Martin. It's a lock, and you're going to get paid lavishly. we had the CDC, the head of the CDC. This is people, and this is another area. I have been studying corruption in the medical industry for a long time because I'm very interested in all the vaccine injuries that have occurred in the last 20 years that have been whitewashed. But the lady who forced the Gardasil vaccination on young girls, which is the most sinister bullshit ever. The idea that the human papilloma virus causes cervical cancer is absolute bullshit. And the idea that you're going to prevent cervical cancer by giving 12-year-old girls, Gardasil vaccination, against it is it's sick. And it's injured a lot of girls. And now they're trying to give it to boys. I mean, it's just so evil. So this woman who rammed
they want to give it to babies.
Oh my God. I didn't even know that. Anyway, the woman that rammed that through, literally, the day she left the CDC, head of CDC, she moved into a $7 million job at Merck, which is the maker of Gardasil, plus stock options and all this other stuff. And as if that's not bad enough, she's lauded as an example of what a woman can accomplish in this world. Like someone someone that young girls should look up to. So yeah, there's a lot of, it's not a lot of them, a lot of people, but it's at the high levels, you're going to find, these kinds of people, and they're there for a reason. They're there because they have that sort of lust for power, and they're all about themselves, and they serve the purposes of the professional bribers, which would include pharma, would include the defense industry.
So what do you with all the history you've studied, have you come up with any good ways to fight, there's horrible corruption?
This is step one. I think this is an education. If people aren't educated, if they don't know anything about this, and I mean, the amount of work I've had to put in to put all these pieces together, I mean, it's not trivial, So everything starts as education. So we're doing this call. That maybe one more person than knew this yesterday will now know it, So I mean, it was like when the internet, there were literally the number of people that believed the internet could have been commercialized. You could have fit around a card table at one point. There really weren't that many people in fact, in 93, I went to the top online media conference in the world. This was when CompuServe ruled the roost. And they had a panel on, can the internet be commercialized? Not when, not how, but is it even possible? And half the panelists said no. And the other half of the panelists said, I think so, but I don't know how. So it all starts with education. We have a problem in that, our media is absolutely corrupt. Our tech media, the tech companies that have taken control of the alternative media, which Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, they used to be alternative media channels. Facebook and Twitter, I mean, not Facebook, but YouTube and Twitter still are, but they ban stuff like yesterday. A friend posted something from the European Journal of Medicine, just like a, totally plain vanilla, medical journal that asked a question about COVID. It was a scientific paper and it was formed as a question. Twitter, if you clicked on it, said dangerous link. All right. So that's that. And then we had Amazon. I was helping a woman who wrote a book on her extensive successful record in reversing certain cases of autism. And Amazon took her book off Amazon. And they took the books of anybody that talked about the substance that she uses off Amazon. This is including medical doctors and PhDs in biochemistry. So, fairly serious books removed from Amazon. So, and then of course Facebook is doing what they're doing. And then Google, 2 years ago, Google completely changed. And this is a problem. Google is in the pharmaceutical business now. Amazon wants to be delivering meds to people. I'm sure little Mark Zuckerberg wants his finger in that pie too somehow. I don't know if Twitter has an idea for that, but Amazon and Google are in the pharmaceutical business. They're in it. Like Google has its own line of vitamins. They like to see what works and then make their own brand and then eliminate and then use the data that they've stolen from their customers to design their marketing. I mean, it's just so unbelievably sinister. Of course, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, so everything.
Yeah, I don't ever say anything bad about him.
Yeah.
But have you, it'll be interesting. I'm not tasking you certainly, but a thing to look back would be look back in history and look how these terrible things were put to an end or how they ended. Did they truly end? And maybe there would be insight there on how to put an end to this, put a stop to this.
Well, I hate to be, I'm functionally optimistic. I'm functionally optimistic. However, I'm also, I try to be as realistic as I can. We have not succeeded in reversing the AIDS fraud. And again, if people, you gotta go to the Brass Check website and search, because it's blocked from all the search engines, but it's, Fauci's first fraud, HIV equals AIDS. That's a blatant fraud that is responsible for the theft of, as I mentioned earlier, over $500 billion in research money alone. Not to mention the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people that were given AZT. I mean, that was a total catastrophe, and that thing is ongoing. There's not even a dent in that thing. If we look at cancer almost certainly is a combination of nutritional deficiency and environmental poisoning, including the crap that's in processed food. At least a lot of cases are resulting in that. So what do we have? We have an industry that gives people, chemotherapy and radiation that beats their immune system to a pulp. The theory being if we kill a lot of stuff, hopefully we won't kill the patient and he'll recover. I mean, that's basically their theory. So that no one's put a dent in that. These medical things are really apparently just based on observation, really, really hard. Diabetes, adult onset diabetes, that really seems to be a nutritional issue. It seems to be a function of, this sort of, industrial diet.
Yeah, but diabetes is no big deal. It only affects a billion people worldwide. So
oh yeah, exactly. And
it's their fault too for eating badly.
Well, wherever the diet changes from traditional to industrial crap, the diabetes rates explodes. It's maybe more science needs to be done, and yet people reverse it all the time. Like for instance, something really, this is important stuff. There was a thing called margarine. I mean, and the other area of corruption that we've made no dent in at all, especially in the United States, is the adulterated food supply. Like, the adulteration of food is a crime, right? And there are a lot of substances that are in processed American foods that if you put them in food in even in China, but certainly in Europe and Canada and Australia and places like that, you would go to jail. And it's legal. It's mainstream in the United States to put those things in food. Like, for instance, this is really interesting, in this at Money Power. Procter & Gamble, made a lot of its money from margarine, and what is margarine? Margarine is cottonseed oil. And if you read the history of cottonseed oil, cottonseed was considered a toxic substance. Nobody ate it. And then there were some shady livestock, operators that would feed their livestock, cottonseed. And that was considered like a really low class thing to do. And then some diabolical guy figured out that you could make something that kind of looked like butter and spread like butter. And if you dyed it, because it would be gray otherwise, if you dyed it yellow, it would kind of look like butter. And you could make it out of garbage, literally garbage. Cottonseed was garbage. It was something you threw away. And, if you could somehow package it as a healthy, it was packaged as a healthy alternative to butter. And people for decades were consuming this stuff by the tub. And, they knew it was poison. So we haven't, I don't think margarine, but I think it's still for sale. I think you can still buy it in the stores. I think there are people that still eat it. And,
yeah, it's still around.
Yeah. And I bet there are food makers that use it in their products.
You think at best this will simmer down to a low boil, but it'll be with us forever?
I'll tell you what my fear is.
Or do you feel like the powers that be are like, wow, it's finally working as well as we want. Let's keep pushing.
Yeah, well, for sure. And for sure. And they're going to keep pushing. And, you talked earlier about, how is it that they tell us what they're going to do in advance? Well, Gates, we all have video. We all have seen the video of him in March of 2020 saying he wants a universal vaccination, and he wants digital vaccination record ID. And they're already, that's, LA's doing it. It's voluntary. It's a service to their citizens. Using your Apple Wallet, see Apple's involved, using your Apple Wallet, you can have a digital verification that you've received the vaccination. So who's going to go along with this? Well, airlines, because they're terrified. They're 1 foot in the grave financially. Are they going to stand up and say, we're not going to go with this? If government says, hey, you're only getting the money if you go with this, they're going to go with it. So airlines are going to do it. Hotels, they're in the same boat as the airlines. Cause now we all have these, I don't have a smartphone, never had a smartphone, never wanted one, I don't think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I don't think it's too good. It's like, I'll do my computing on a desktop at home. And when I'm away from home, I don't need to be tracked. And if I really need to find something, I'll ask somebody or I'll get a map, or I'll wait till I get home and I'll look it up on the internet, but now we have everybody with a smartphone. So, but that'll be interesting. Can they compel us to get a smartphone?
Well, they're already trying to compel people to get the vaccine, talking about, the airlines, Ticketmaster mentioned it. There's various pundits that are saying it's a good idea. So, but there's also pushback,
Oh, well, well, here's the thing. I watched in amazement as the airlines bought the 9/11, bullshit. Now, whether you believe the official story or not, the response was insane, and continues to be insane, and, at the airports. And, if they really cared about bombs, they would have trained a generation of bomb-sniffing dogs. There is nothing better for detecting explosives than a trained bomb-sniffing dog. You can't fool them, and they find everything. Those stupid screening boxes that people walk through, they're jokes. They're absolute jokes. They're expensive jokes, and they made who that guy, forget it. He was head of Homeland Security for a while. He personally made a fortune on those. But they don't really care. They didn't really care about security, and they were annoying their customers. They were making flying an absolute miserable experience. You think, and a lot of people, and airline travel diminished, and you would think people in the airline industry would have stood up and said, hey, you're hurting our business. Why don't we have some real security here? But they never did. So my fear is that, if the government tells them your $1 billion bailout is dependent on you screening your patients, well, they've turned that's the thing. They've turned the entire world into a patient, which is
right. Everyone, yeah.
If we pull this back all the way, what is the goal of a corrupt doctor? The goal of a corrupt doctor is to convince a rich person that they have a fatal disease that only that doctor can cure, of course, at great expense. That's the goal of a corrupt doctor. So what's the goal of a corrupt medical system? Is to convince the world that everybody's either sick or potentially sick or a carrier of disease, and the only solution is what we do. So this is corrupt medicine played out to its fullest possible expression. So I see the airports going with it. I see the hotels going with it. I'm already mentally adjusting to the idea I may never get on a plane again. I'm already mentally adjusting to the idea that I may never stay. This is terrible, but I may never stay in a hotel again. Now, Ticketmaster, very easy to make the word go down from the feds to the governor to the mayor of Los Angeles, that piece of insane crap, that, he can shut down the rock show. He can tell you, no, you're not going to have the KISS 40th year reunion, unless you put up.
It's like all the laws in the world are just, I mean, now they've all split into double standards. You know, you can go out and riot for one reason, but you can't, you know, be in church. I was in a restaurant today. I don't know, 100-something people there without masks. The staff has masks. Why magically is that okay instead of, you know, instead of like a hair salon or a gym? It's ridiculous.
What state are you in?
I'm in Texas.
You're in Texas. Yeah, like, I mean, and here's a question. The churches, what the hell? Really? You don't stand up for your parishioners? You don't stand up for, I mean, you know, but you know what? I'm trying to remember. There was a program, a government program. First of all, a lot of churches got financial bailouts. A lot of, especially the big mega churches, were treated like employers, because I guess they are employers, and they got all the loans and the whatever the PPP, whatever the money was that was flying around. There's one guy, Orstein, Joel Orstein or something.
Oh, Joel Osteen.
Osteen.
He got a huge church.
He got $7 million or something. So, you know, they all got some money, and probably somebody sat down and explained to him, this is for the good of society and blah, blah, blah. And he thought, well, $7 million, good of society, good enough for me. But yeah, that's insane. You can't go to church. You can't sit quietly and you know, it's incredible. So where do I see this going? Now here's the thing. So everybody that wants to participate in these various functions, going to rock concerts, going on a plane, staying in a hotel, getting on a bus, you know, getting on the Amtrak, you're going to maybe renting a car. I don't know. I mean, you're going to have to comply. You're going to have a smartphone. You're going to have a thing that shows that you're fully vaccinated. Now, here's the thing. Once they've done that, they have accomplished permanent lockdown, because, okay, yeah, you're locked in your house and you can travel around. But what if they declare a new pandemic? And we already know they declare these pandemics in absence of scientific, or medical reason. They're
already saying that a new one's going to come. And yeah.
So now, they can say, well, you know, you got to lock down until the variation of variation of the vaccine's ready. You know, right now they have a little logistical logjam. You know, it is actually hard to make all this stuff and deploy it and pretend that it is kosher. You know, it's actually hard to fake it. But they'll figure that part out. Someone's going to figure it out. And they're going to declare, well, you know, you guys, can't leave your house for the next 7 days until you get, the next round of vaccinations, and it will never end. It will never end. And every time they need money or they feel like they want to, you know, throw their weight around, there's going to be a new problem, and it's just going to go on and on. So, and I know this is, you know, I don't know what the solution is. Now, again, I'm functionally optimistic, so I'm doing the research. We're spending time on the phone. I'm explaining, you know, the structure of this thing so people can see this is real. This is not a happenstance. This is not I mean, in a sense, it is a collection of idiots doing idiotic things, but it's also a structured thing that was planned. I think it worked, you know, like all, it's a coup. And like all coups, you try a lot of stuff and you hope it works, and sometimes it doesn't, you know, and sometimes it works beyond your wildest imagination. There are a lot of coups that shouldn't have worked, you know. Like the coup in Guatemala in the 1950s, boy, if the guy that was president of the country then had just made a few different choices, that it might not have worked. Even the coup in Iran, you know, in the 50s, you know, it was touch and go there. And, not every coup works. And, this, you know, but sometimes they do. And, this one worked. It's a coup. This is a coup by the, you know, technocrats, big tech people, who are in bed with the big pharma people. And the bankers seem to be totally happy to go with it. I know a lot of smart Wall Street people, and I'm so disappointed in their acceptance of this. Some of them are like, God, this seems crazy, you know, but pretty much they're just going to trade around it. You know, they're not going to question it. And it's funny, these guys that are really, and not everybody on Wall Street is intelligent, and not everybody on Wall Street is insightful, and a lot of them are idiots. They just got lucky with a couple of hands, and But I know some people that are genuinely intelligent, and they really are perceptive, and they really dig deep. And if a company is on shaky ground, they'll figure it out, But they won't look at this. They're just, it's the mantra is the vaccine. When the vaccine comes, then we'll get back to normal, and they're basically trading around. And here's the other thing. Maybe this is, I could talk all night. If you've got money and you know what to do, this thing is not a problem. It's a payday. I didn't lose any money in 2020. And obviously I'm not with these people, and I don't want this to be working, but I own real estate in the Hudson Valley, and I know how to trade stocks, and I have felt no pain. And if I'm not feeling pain, people with infinite more resource than I have, the top 10 people in the world added $1.2 trillion to their net worth in the last year.
Oh yeah. Yep. They've done phenomenally well.
So, and who are they? They're Gates, Bezos, Zuckerberg, and who's censoring all the health information?
Yeah.
I mean, it's, and where's our Congress? They're nowhere. Where's our news media? They're nowhere. So there are times, when individuals and families and informal communities, like people listening to the show, need to put on their big boy pants and just, start dealing, taking care of business at home and amongst the people close to them. And, thank God my brother, and his boys understand this is bullshit. I don't have to explain it to them, but we have family members that don't get it. And
I know plenty of people that are still scared out of their minds, which is insane.
Yeah. And I don't blame them, because I wrote this thing today. Maybe we'll end on this, because otherwise it'll never end. The story about a deadly, never-before-seen virus that spreads like wildfire and kills everyone in its path unless we follow the guidance of reliable authorities is indeed a terrifying story. The problem is, this is not a never-before-seen virus. It's a coronavirus. We've seen, the SARS-1 virus is as close to this virus as a chimpanzee is to, an orangutan. I mean, they're in the same family. They're not that far apart.
Right.
What this virus is, does this virus really cause? That's a whole nother issue. Does it spread like wildfire? Not as bad as some things. And you know what? A lot of things spread like wildfire. All that matters is the death rate. Does it kill everyone in its path? Well, as of September 20th, 2020, the death rate among people 20 to 49 was 99.98 survival rate, right? In other words, that's the survival rate. So the death rate was 0.02%, and that's of the cases that got to the point that required medical treatment. So if it
was even accurate, yeah.
So the real death rate is probably, nothing. So it doesn't kill everybody in its path. And then the last part of the equation of this deadly, never-before-seen virus spreads like wildfire, kills everyone in its path unless we follow the guidance of reliable authorities. Well, we know who these authorities are. They're Bill Gates, they're Tony Fauci, they're Jeff Bezos via his mouthpiece at the Washington Post, they're NBC News, There are all these ridiculous, the Rachel Maddow, she's an authority we should be following. Anderson Cooper, are you kidding? And yet that's what people are following. So if you accept the story that there's a deadly, never-before-seen virus that spreads like wildfire and kills everyone in its path unless we follow the guide of reliable authorities, if you accept that, you're going to be scared out of your mind. And fortunately, those pieces, never before seen, blah, 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 they're all false, and nobody's questioning them, or they're not being questioned on a large scale. Twitter is a little bit of an echo chamber, so I see a lot among my Twitter friends. They seem to get it, but I don't know what percentage of the population that is. Well, I'll say this. When I see working men, mostly contractors, guys who actually do things for a living, I don't see any of them worried or they wear a mask out of courtesy, but when we say, hey, you don't need that mask, off it comes. They're only wearing it because they don't want to lose business. But among working people who work for a living, I don't see a lot of buying into this. So
yeah, when I go to businesses, I see a few every day that no one's wearing a mask. As soon as customers come, they put it up. No one. But there are still a good amount of people that are bullies and try to say, "Put your mask on." And it's amazing how they turn people against each other. It's sad.
I had a clerk, a girl clerk, in our little neighborhood food market. I have a scarf, because it's winter and it's cold up here in the north. And, so when I walk into a store, I just pull the scarf up around my mouth and nose, not going to get into a big thing. She told me that's not a real mask. So luckily I'm fast on my,
What is it real?
So luckily I'm fast on my feet, and I said, what about your mask? You know what? I don't think that's a real mask either. And you know what? I might need to call the health department and have them come in and examine your mask. What do you think of that? So that shut her up pretty fast.
Good.
But not everybody's that fast on their feet, and some people get intimidated, and it's well, we could go on forever on this, but anyway,
right.
The network, understand that this network of propaganda and even intimidation, shaming and bullshit was created over a period of decades. And it started with the CDC back in the 50s, creating this epidemic in intelligence service. And what I didn't tell you, this is really important, is every year they bring in the best and the brightest. They train them for 2 years, and then they send them out to the world. And what do? They become public health officers of states, counties, and cities. They become reporters, science reporters for the New York Times, literally. All right. So over the last, when were the 50s? That's almost 70 years ago. They've had, it's nearly 70 years of taking super ambitious, super articulate, super motivated people, brainwashing them and sending them out and basically filling all the public health slots, a lot of the science reporting slots, some of the medical leadership slots, so that when this COVID bullshit started, they could just flip the switch and they had the whole thing wired. And then they also had, there's a huge network of HIV equals AIDS, bullshit, promoters with very lucrative profession, by the way. If you ever need a job, there's plenty of money to be made in that field. And those people were also in place already, also in public health, because a lot of money gets funneled that way down those channels. And so those people were activated as well. So when you see how fast this thing switched on, part of it was the news media lying, but part of it was you had a public health infrastructure that was saturated with CDC and NIH and Fauci, scammers, basically grifters. Some of them knowingly, some of them unknowingly. We're talking thousands of people in place ready to, take orders.
I guess we haven't made much progress with treating cancer, but we've gotten really good at human manipulation and mental manipulation. So we're like, amazing superstar doctors in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's been a while since we put a man on the moon, but yeah, we can sell any matter of bullshit. Yeah, again, I'm functionally optimistic in that, we're alive and humanity's lived for a long time, and it's never been easy. There are certain populations that have, I think of, villagers in rural Vietnam waking up one morning and B-52s are flying over their heads, dropping bombs on their rice fields. And they don't know why and what, and, and we're not as in that bad a situation, but, it's comparable. It's comparable. We're minding our own business, going about our lives. And next thing we know, we turn the TV on and the equivalent of a carpet bombing took place, psychologically. And that's how they do it. That's how they do it. Shock and awe. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Functionally.
Well, very good.
Yeah. Thanks for giving me the chance, because surprisingly few people are interested in interviewing me, and I appreciate that you are.
No, I appreciate it, Ken. It's been, I'm trying to figure this stuff out. That's why I've been asking, and, Yeah, this is great. And thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.